Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, book 2 of the Collegium Chronicles. Now, the first one, was a lot of just Mags getting used to living in civilization, not being a slave. I mean, there was a plot, there were foreigners, there were people kidnapping people, but a lot of it, there was not so much plot there. This was, the first one was very much the first book in a several book arc, and it's a lot more of character and setting and putting things in place uh, than it was, complicated plotting. Intrigues, however, actually has, you know, a plot line as opposed to just, here, Mags, let's put you in this place and watch you react. This is also the book that introduces something that winds up being a massive thematic, well, not thematic, central plot character element throughout the series, and that is the game of Kerbal, which is kind of a bit of polo and a certain amount of war games, and the key here is that it's very genuinely war games. It's very genuinely meant to act as a training vehicle. And so while it is ultimately a sport in the way that we would recognize it, it lacks in a lot of ways, it lacks aspects of the much more simplified sort of sport that we're used to. Part of the reason for that, of course, is because we're not used to playing with horses that are of human intelligence with magic powers. Because, for all companions like to complain, they're not horses, they are totally horses. But the thing is that what you've got this game where you are trying to score goals on the opposing team's goal, but you're also trying to capture a flag and take it back to your place. You have 4 people who are on foot, you have 4 people who are on horseback, and you have 4 people who are on companion back. And so you have 4 people, and so the idea was very much to simulate the chaos of the battlefield, where you will have infantry and you would have cavalry, and then you would also, because this is Valdemar, have heralds. And the idea was to get everybody practice with that, and to in some ways encourage the students, because that's very explicitly said in this book, actually, is that it's an attempt to encourage students, because it's one of those historical truisms that, young people always feel that they're immortal. And the thing is that Mags is different, because Mags grew up in a place where he had seen several people get killed, where he had known if he wasn't really careful he would absolutely die. Whereas most of the kids in the Collegium, in all 3 collegia, as well as in the Guard, have not genuinely faced the reality of their own mortality. And so it's harder for them to take things like that seriously, because, it's always hard to take things like that seriously until you've had an experience that makes it kind of inevitable and important. So Kerbal was supposed to give them an encouragement to develop certain skill sets that they just otherwise might slack off on. But Mags, who is a tremendously talented rider, more talented than the average herald, which says a lot, because heralds, of necessity, they are supposed to, of necessity, be able to live in the saddle. That's why they have companions. And it's extremely rare that you find a herald who's, going to be a subpar rider, because even a herald who isn't coming up until we get to the Herald Alberic series, which isn't coming up for a while because Harold Alberich's story hits right before the start of the main series, because the main series starts with the Arrows trilogy. That was, that was the first book written, that was the first trilogy written, and Alberich, his series is taking place sort of right before Talia, because he was weapons master when Talia arrived. And his story kind of sets up the political situation that Talia wanders into in that first book. But anyways, but, you have people who are, even though they're all above average, you're still going to have some people who are more above average than others. In this case, Mags is more above average than others. The thing about Intrigues is that during Intrigues, the thing is, it starts off with just, Mags's ordinary life, and then the Four Seers have a vision of some sort of a foreigner standing in front of the king, who is the king is covered in blood and looking horrified. The thing is that, as with anyone who talks about clairvoyancy with any sort of realism, because this is a universal thing. I mean, when you talk to people who claim that they're clairvoyants, if they're genuine, good, honest people, they will all admit that they'll say that seeing into the future is a spotty business. And indeed, you talk to near universally across fiction, unless it's bad fiction, seeing into the future is a dangerous proposition, because the further you see into the future, the more uncertain everything is. Foreknowledge of the future can change it. And in the case of Foreseers, in the Mercedes Lackey universe, they tend to get glimpses. So they get a glimpse like you're in the car and you're driving past the scene of an accident at 60 miles an hour. Sure, as you drive past the accident, you can see there was a blue car and a gray car, and the blue car's front end is crumpled, but you very likely won't be able to pick out the license plates, you won't be able to pick out the makes of the car necessarily, because you just hurtled right on past. And you kind of caught it out of the corner of your eye as you were approaching, whipped your head around, and you don't necessarily find yourself able to determine if that's a Chevy Impala or an Acura or a whatever. You can't see how many people are standing around or whatever. You see somebody is sitting at the side of the road, but you don't see if they're actually hurt or if they're just there. And that foreseeing in the Mercedes Lackey universe is like that. It's like driving past a scene at 60 miles an hour. You can see some things, but you have no context, and you can't be completely sure of the things you do see. Unfortunately, because Mags is a foreigner, everybody starts to just lose their minds. And it is in some ways reminiscent of right after Harry turned out to be a parcel mouth in the second book, which title is escaping me because, heavens forfend, I should actually know the title of a book. So, it's very much like that. It's a lot of people whispering behind their hands. It's a lot of people saying, clearly he must be evil because we have this one fact which might possibly fit this situation. Mags winds up exceedingly upset because he's sure he doesn't have a lot of friends, sure he's not the most popular person in the world, but there's a difference between people quietly letting you go about your business and not really paying attention to you, and having everyone pay attention to you for the worst possible reason. Now, his friends wind up standing by him, and his new Kerbal team winds up standing by him, but things are still very, very problematic. And so as you go through this book, the curveball winds up being, of course, a very important central part of things. But there also winds up being a whole issue with an assassination, with an assassin, and Mags is forced, among other things, to go skulking around after an assassin who winds up nicknamed Temper, and Temper at the end of the book tries to set fire to the companion stables. Anyway, there's a lot of angst that goes on in this book, not surprisingly. I mean, and that's the thing about this, but the thing about this is that Mags winds up thinking throughout this that there's a sense of familiarity, a sense of odd kinship he feels with this man known as Temper. And over the course of this series, it develops that these assassins, these people, it turns out eventually that Mags is from where they're from, but that's another one of the important themes in this series, and it's a theme that comes up here, is that question of bad blood. That is, do your antecedents define you? And that's something that Mags winds up struggling with a lot through this, through portions of this series, just because, your antecedents may not define you to yourself, but they can define you to other people. And the thing is that part of what's, the reason this is called Intrigues is also because this introduces Mags's effective apprenticeship to the King's own Nickolas, except that Mags's apprenticeship to Nickolas, again, this is a thing that it runs through the whole series, is that there's always a herald or two who makes it his or her job to basically go undercover, to act as a sort of king's spy master, to hang around in the lower city to find out what's going on in places where regular sources of information to the throne can't go. And it is unusual that the King's Own would be this spy master. I mean, how could it not be unusual, given that the King's Own, the job of the King's Own is to be the king's advisor and best friend and person who provides the best advice to the monarch, in some ways even holding some of the powers of the monarch, and that's not usually the position that a spy master has. But Nickolas has a very particular set of well-developed talents, and he takes on Mags because somebody's going to have to be effectively spy master after Nickolas, because at some point Nickolas will die, and so Mags is apprenticed to Nickolas to learn how to act as a spy. And that of course means being able to play the James Bond role, where everyone notices you in your flashy, natty getup as you walk around and socialize with everyone, as well as sneaking around and skulking on rooftops, as well as pretending to be a page in Mags's case. And so there's a lot about Mags learning these kinds of things. It comes up, it starts in the first book when Mags goes to to a midwinter party, but it escalates in this book. And this is where we really start to see Mags's apprenticeship to Nickolas take front and center. And I'm going to try to wind this down because I have less than 20 seconds left. So I've rambled a lot, and I will talk about the next one in this series next week.